Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a really special treat for you guys in my Shroud Wars series here. A personal friend of Barrie Schwortz is coming on, Arif Khan. Hey, Arif.
Hey, pleased to meet you.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to bring Arif on because obviously people are familiar with my Shroud Wars debates where I brought on various sides. I brought on skeptics, I brought on atheists and Christians and Jews. But this is going to be a first. This time I'm actually bringing on a Muslim to present sort of a Islamic perspective on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, I think that'll be very interesting for the audience there. And obviously, the first thing to do, I just want to turn it straight over to you as the guest to kind of introduce us as to who you are, maybe give us a little bit about your own faith journey and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for, firstly, thanks for having me. And I realize it is a little bit unusual having a Muslim with an interest in the Shroud. It's always sparks a good conversation. When I'm interested, when I'm involved in Shroud discussions or events. So thanks for this opportunity. So a little bit about me. So I think the best place to start, is probably, I'm a regular person. I'm a father of two based in the UK. I have a career and a professional life that is sadly less interesting than what we're going to be talking about today. But I have a passion and a background in research into the Shroud of Turin, but also more broadly, I would say Christian Islamic dialogue. I'm a Muslim who's been born in the UK. I've lived in the UK all my life, so very much been exposed to Christianity from a very early age. Been to school here in the UK, have a lot of Christian friends, so it's always fascinated me in terms of the dialogue between Muslims and Christians. And what we're going to talk about a lot today is the response to the person of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. So that's where my interest has always been. So then in terms of other things I've been involved in, I'm part of a magazine called the Review of Religions. That magazine has been running for over 100 years. I'm the deputy editor for the Christianity section of that magazine. It's a comparative religious magazine. It is produced by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And then also there's a radio station called the Voice of Islam Radio, which has been set up a few years ago in the UK. And I'm a co-host of a show called The Pathway to Peace. So those are some of the kind of formal things I do for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. But of course, I am a member, a practicing Ahmadiyya Muslim as well.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, with that said, I think the first thing to get into is to kind of like get an understanding of, what is Islam in general, and like how does your particular sect within Islam compare or relate to Islam? What are some of the similarities and differences and that sort of thing?
Sure, exactly. So what is Islam? Big question. I think the best way to look at Islam and the way Islam defines itself is a continuation of a faith tradition. It's a continuation. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is one in a line of messengers that goes on thousands of years. So Islam, the Quran talks about there being over 100,000 prophets. The Quran says that there's not one people on the planet, on earth, who we've not sent a messenger to. So Islam should be seen as very much a continuation of previous traditions, faith traditions, in particular the Abrahamic faiths. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are very deeply linked. They have a lot of common heritage. There's so many more similarities than differences in those faiths. So Islam, I think the best way of viewing it is, and the best way of viewing Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the next in a line of messengers or prophets. He did come with a law. He did come with a new book, religious text or revelation, a new law. But that law is an evolution, we would say, of the previous teachings of other faiths. So I think that's the best way of looking at Islam overall. Because it came after Christianity and Judaism, it's able to specifically talk about Muslims and Christians. The Holy Quran talks about Muslims Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It talks about them in detail. It talks about them as refers to Christians and Jews as the people of the book, along with Muslims, and they're given special privileges as well. They're in a specific category, described as the people of the book. And Muslims are taught that these Jews and Christians are those closest to you in your faith. They're very similar. I think in the modern day, we emphasize the differences more than understand the similarities. There's a lot more similarities and differences. So that, I think, is the right context to view Islam as a faith tradition. It was basically an evolution of previous religions. And then the Ahmadiyya Muslim faith, there's only really one difference, but it leads to multiple differences. The real difference is, the only difference is that in the Islamic faith, and other faiths as well, there is a tradition of a reformer or a messiah or a prophet coming towards the end of time. The Christians have the view about Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, returning in his second coming. The Hindus talk about the second coming of Krishna. Buddhists also believe that Buddha will return many times in different forms. And so there is these traditions about an imam or a prophet coming towards the end of time. In the Islamic tradition, there's two specific figures that I mentioned. One is mentioned that Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, will return. So that's an interesting similarity. Some may not know. Both Islam and Christianity believes that. But then also it talks about a figure called the Imam Mahdi, or the guided one. And it describes different characteristics of the two people. The claim of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and it's a huge claim, is that the founder of their community, of our community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, peace be upon him, he made the claim in 1889, or he created the community in 1889, said God had told him that this was what he was to do. And specifically in 1891, he said through revelation, he'd been told that he was that Messiah. He was the fulfillment of these prophecies, about there coming someone towards the end of time to try and unite religion, to bring people closer to God as well. So on the basis of that revelation, he founded this community, and he was clear that it was within the precepts of Islam. We still very much believe we're Muslims, but we believe that awaited Messiah or awaited reformer has come, and that's the claim of this community. And in the same breath, I want to say that claim has led to very different responses. There are those that have embraced the community, and there are literally organizations whose sole aim is to destroy the community. It's seen as a heretical belief within Islam. We're very much used to being in a minority in terms of this belief, but the community is growing into tens of millions. So that's the main difference between the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. The debate really is, has the figure of the second coming of Jesus, the advent of this Imam Mahdi in Islamic tradition, has that been fulfilled in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian in India, or has that not? And that's really what polarizes the different responses, and that's what makes the community unique. The last thing I'll say, just to introduce the community, is after the founder passed away in 1908, since then there's been a sequence of successors. So through an electoral college, there's been someone appointed, voted for, who is then the spokesperson, the leader of the community. And we give him the title of Caliph or Khalifa. So that's another unique aspect of our community, is that they have one central leader, similar in ways to the Pope in the Catholic tradition. One central leader to kind of unite us, which is something we don't see in other aspects in the Muslim world.
Gotcha. Okay, so apart from that aspect of the return of the Messiah, you're like any other Muslim in terms of the 5 pillars, or
correct?
Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so I guess kind of getting into this, obviously this is a Shroud Wars type deal, so I kind of want to focus in on your guys' belief on the death and resurrection of Jesus in general. What is your guys' view about that? And then I know that you guys also have a belief about Jesus traveling to India.
Yes.
So yeah, do you want to kind of familiarize the audience with your guys' take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should have said in the intro as well, that the topic of Jesus in India has been fascinating to me. So the founder of the community, who I mentioned earlier, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he actually wrote a book entitled Jesus in India. Now, why did he write that? He concluded from the scripture in the Holy Quran that although the orthodox view amongst many Muslims is that Prophet Jesus is still alive in some way, his conclusion was that based on the Quranic verses, for example, saying that all prophets have passed away, he was of the belief that Prophet Jesus had also died a natural death like anyone else, any other person. So then it was a case of, well, what happened to him? Is there evidence of any kind of tradition of a post-crucifixion life, maybe, of Jesus? Is there a tomb anywhere? So in doing that research, he then produced this book, one of the last books he wrote actually before he died, and it was entitled Jesus in India. So the Ahmadiyya community have always had this belief around Prophet Jesus having a post-crucifixion life and traveling to India. I got really into this theory when I was at university. I've discovered now that's when you have time. So even though my thesis, my doctorate, or my postgraduate was all in computer science, I had time to study and read widely, and I think most of the books that I've read about the historical Jesus, Christian and New Testament scholarship, and a lot of these topics, the Shroud as well, was during that time, and I could really dig into it. I got involved in a website called the Tomb of Jesus website, and as part of that, I was interviewed for a documentary in 2008 by an American film producer called Paul David. So he created a documentary on the topic of Jesus in India. And as part of that, I was interviewed for that. It's available. You can find it online. There's a listing on IMDb. What I found as part of that interview, there was something I explained to him, and I don't think I'd put it into words before, but I basically said to him that actually the events of the crucifixion and what happened at the crucifixion it's literally the one event, if you like, that really causes a divergence between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I'll explain why I think that is. From a Jewish point of view, there were many people who came along and claimed to be the Messiah. And basically, a lot of them were put to death or died. So from a Jewish point of view, if Jesus had been arrested, apprehended, and then executed, that would be evidence that he was a failed Messiah. He wasn't a true Messiah. And this was a way to say his claim had ended. He had made this claim, but it had ended. If he was true, God would have found some way to save him. He would have been successful. But the fact that that his life ended there is a sign of failure. The Christian viewpoint is, well, actually, that was a key part of his mission. It was to come, die, and then also after that, we have the resurrection. So that, if you like, is the part that the Jews are essentially missing, is that actually, no, he didn't die, or maybe he did die and he was resurrected. And there was a glorious, advent of what happened afterwards. That is when he was successful, he conquered death, etc. So that's one divergence. The Islamic viewpoint is really interesting because there's different interpretations, like so many things in life. It comes down to how you interpret scripture. So the Quran talks about the crucifixion, and it says that it makes a list. It lists different claims from the Jews at the time, and it says one claim is the Jews mentioned that we killed Jesus the Messiah. And in the Quran, God responds to them directly. The Quran is often written in the first person. God says, they didn't kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear that way. This is how it was made to appear. It was made to appear that way. The Arabic word used there basically means that there was a resemblance or semblance of this was how it was made to look. Now, there's two ways of interpreting that. One viewpoint is, well, actually, Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, was never put on the cross in the first place. It was made to appear like he was on the cross, but maybe someone was put in his place, and we don't even know who that someone is. There's different theories. But the Ahmadiyya Muslim theology, if you like, which claims to not be anything different, but a reinterpretation of the original scripture, actually says slightly differently. It says, yes, Prophet Jesus was placed on the cross, but he didn't die. It was made to appear that he had died, but actually he survived that crucifixion. So that's an equally valid interpretation of the same Quranic verse, we would argue. Ahmadiyya Muslims would take that viewpoint. So from that point of view, it's like, well, actually, now you've got a third interpretation. You've got the Jewish view of he was a failed Messiah, and that claim to being the Messiah ended with his death on the cross. You've got the Christian viewpoint around, actually, no, he came to die for our sins, and he did, and he was then resurrected, which shows that he was more than a human. And then you've got the Islamic interpretation, which varies, but one interpretation, the one I would favor, is actually, there was a plot to put him to death, to basically end his mission, but God miraculously saved him from that death, and he was able to survive, he was able to recover, and then continue on his mission, after the crucifixion. So it's amazing how the crucifixion has such a crucial part, the crucifixion and whether there was a resurrection. The first thing I wanted to say about that is really the crux of where these three kind of major Abrahamic faiths, where they vary.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One thing, it's not on my list of questions, but one thing just to follow up. Are you familiar with there's an interpretation within Islam by Gabriel Said Reynolds? I think he wrote a paper, and he actually he tries to say that actually you can interpret that Quranic verse as saying, yeah, Jesus did die, but it's just denying that the Jews killed him, which is the Rome. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I guess how would you say, is there any room within Islam to affirm that maybe Jesus did die, or do you think an interpretation like that is just out of bounds within Islam.
Ultimately, he did die. Ultimately, he did die. And it talks about the death of Jesus in the Quran as well. So there's a extract in the Quran where God says, imagine in the future. It talks about a hypothetical situation in the future. And this is more around, which I'm sure we'll get into, the claim of Jesus. What was his status? So it talks about, think about the time when Jesus is brought in front of God, and God will say to him, Jesus, did you tell people to worship you and your mother, as gods almost? And he would say, and the Quran says, Jesus will respond by saying, holy are you, God. I would not do anything that you had, wouldn't say anything unless you told me to say it. I wouldn't have said these things. And then it goes on to say, and since you've caused me to, since I've died, you've been a watcher over the people. I don't know what's happened since then. So the Quran does support the idea of Jesus having died. I think where there isn't room in the Islamic interpretation is a sort of a death and resurrection, and Jesus physically being alive again on the earth, having previously died. That is where it would draw the line. The Quran does talk about that once there is a barrier between life and death, and once you've crossed that barrier, you can't come back. So that's where I think the difference is.
Gotcha. All right, cool. All right, well, so I think your view, as you were saying, is kind of this swoon theory, or
Yeah,
a naturalistic version of the swoon theory. So obviously that's going to be highly controversial for my a
absolutely.
lot of in my audience, and even for myself as well. So
Sure.
I want to kind of ask you, obviously a natural comeback that a lot of scholars will come back on, people like Joseph Bergeron or Mike Licona, those type of Christian apologists and that sort of thing. And they'll say, well, look, a swoon theory, it's just a priori very implausible to happen from a medical perspective. There's various wounds that Jesus is
Yeah.
depicted on, and from a medical perspective, it's very improbable that someone would survive those types of wounds. So, yeah, I want to hear you kind of give a
Yeah,
comment.
absolutely. And I wanted to start off by saying as well, I think, I'm a seeker of the truth, and, as much as anyone else as well. So whatever I say, I'm expressing, my opinion, the views of the Ahmadiyya community, but, we may all be wrong. Who knows what really the truth is? So I want to start off by that. And I want to also say that, I realize that when you have someone like Jesus, who people have such a deep link with, anyone speaking about them or questioning things, it can become a bit emotive. So I approach the subject with absolute respect for the Christian tradition as well. And it's hard to understand the exact facts of what happened 2,000 years ago. But let's talk about the evidence that kind of I draw on, and that others with this viewpoint kind of draw on. So the first is the nature of crucifixion. Now, the reason that a lot of us we don't have a good knowledge of what crucifixion normally looked like is because the only crucifixion we've heard about is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. So that's very common. But traditionally, crucifixion was a very much a long, drawn-out punishment. It wasn't supposed, if you needed to just execute someone quickly, like the Romans had ways of doing that. Crucifixion was designed to last a long time, and it was designed for the person to be shown, in public as a way to, warn others that, if this is what you do, if you try to question the authority or challenge the authority of the Romans, this is what will happen to you. It was supposed to be something that would last many days. I've heard researchers talk about, 10 days potentially or longer, with people dying due to starvation and thirst, or maybe being attacked by wild animals. So crucifixion generally did last a lot longer than we may think, because often we think about this idea of just, we only really talk about Jesus's crucifixion in reality. The other thing in terms of duration and whether it's possible to survive, well, the Jewish historian Josephus talks about a crucifixion in the 1st century as well. He talks about one of his stories. He says that he was returning from another village, from, I think it was the village of Tekoa. And Josephus says that he returns and he saw 3 people he saw some people on crosses, and one of them he recognized as a friend of his. And I'm not saying he's talking about Jesus, by the way, which I got asked once when I shared this story. So he saw people on the cross, and he recognized one of them, and he asked for that person to be taken down. And that person was removed from the cross, and they were able to, survive that. I think I believe it's Indonesia. It might be another country in Asia. There's people who, to this day, reenact the crucifixion in ways. They actually are nailed to crosses. They are put up on a cross during the Easter days as a form of, reverence and remembrance about what Jesus was put through. And they're nailed through the palms and the feet, and they are then taken down afterwards. And they do use real nails with them as well. So we have examples of crucifixion, and we have, we can see and we can try and study what are the aspects of crucifixion, what are the types of injuries that would have been sustained, and how life-threatening are they. I think another thing with the crucifixion of Jesus is that the duration, like I said earlier, duration tended to be long, but with Jesus, if we think about the events, it was only for a few hours, and that was because the Sabbath was coming. So we see this in the New Testament. The accounts talk about, look, the Sabbath is coming, things need to be speeded up. And I think one small detail, which is absolutely crucial, is what happened to the two thieves we are told about who were either side of Jesus. So first of all, we're told that that they were still alive, first of all. So actually, why would the two thieves have died? Have still been alive, but Jesus died, had already died. That's one question. It could be because of the scourging and the night before he was up praying to be saved as well. So it could be those aspects, but there's three there. One, Jesus has already bowed his head down. Now for the thieves, because they're still alive, we read in the New Testament that their legs were broken to hasten death. Now, honestly, if Jesus's legs were also broken, then I think that's the end of the story. Like, he wouldn't have been able to breathe. He was died through asphyxiation fairly quickly if unable to support his own weight. But crucially, his legs were not broken. So what we do know is that his head had bowed down. We know that a few hours before that, or we're told in the New Testament that, he cried out before. There was a cry of anguish before he bowed his head. We also know that some kind of liquid was given to him as well on a sponge. We're told that he was given some kind of substance. And after that, he cried out, he bowed his head, he said, it's finished. Thieves' legs were broken, they were brought down. Jesus's legs were crucially not broken. But then we get to this spear wound in the side, and there's different interpretations of that as well. So there's one German theologian called Holger Kirsten, who's written a few books on the Shroud, but also on the Jesus in India topic, who delved into that account of the spear. Now, often we think that the spear was almost as a way to, finish him off, for want of a better phrase, make sure he was dead. But if they were trying to kill him and spear him, it would have been easier to do that from the front, or it would have been, they could have broken his legs if they were unclear about whether, they thought he may have been dead. Holger Kirsten's interpretation is that spear thrust in the side was a way to check if he was still alive. Was there any movement? Was the body still alive, like prodding a body? Now, Holger Kirsten goes into the Greek word used, and he suggests that Greek word doesn't have I think it's Nicaean is the word. It doesn't have a connotation of much force and deep penetration into the body. It's more of a prod with a spear to see if there's a response from the body. Did the person move or not? And Jesus didn't respond to that. Now, what we do hear is that from that gushed forth or flowed forth blood and water. And so those who believe that Jesus was still alive would say the fact that blood flowed out, or gushed out, was a sign of an active heart. The water could have been release of liquid from the lungs as well. So in a traumatic experience, lungs can fill with a type of water. It's called pleurisy. So we could have elements of pleural water, lung water kind of flowing out. And that's what the blood and water could have represented. Now, I know that every single thing I've just said, there will be a counter argument to it that will literally say the blood and water prove that there was death because it was the separation of blood and serum. So that's been argued as a sign of life, but also as a sign of death as well. So I know it's hotly debated, as we said, and there's multiple interpretations. But some, I would say that is a sign that Jesus was still alive, or there is a possibility he was still alive. And then he was taken down, and Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, to me, are quite mysterious characters. We don't really know too much about who they were or their backgrounds. We know that at that crucial time, they were able to get the body of Jesus, and they were able to put it into a private tomb that Nicodemus, I believe, was the owner. And it was very close to Golgotha, very close to where the crucifixion took place. So they had the body, they took it to the tomb. And then actually, from a gospel account, we don't really know what happened after that. We know that they tended to the body. It talks about using aloe and myrrh. But then after that, what do we know about what happened in the tomb? There is a bit of it is shrouded in mystery. And it's only that, when we get the story of the Marys trying to go and anoint the body or to visit the tomb, that we hear that, the rock was rolled away. And then there's these meetings with a risen Jesus. So yes, that could be interpreted as, he did die and something miraculous happened. But also there is a narrative, and it's not just, it's not just members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community who have written about this. Throughout, I'd say, the last 200 years, there's been different people who have responded and talked about the idea of this, of Prophet Jesus having swooned. And also, if you just think about in the modern day, right, we have stories of near-death experiences. We have stories of people who have looked like they've completely died, but then do revive or come back in some way. And so in 2000 years ago, when we didn't have the medical equipment, and that happens today with modern medical equipment. 2000 years ago, when we didn't have that kind of equipment, is there a possibility that he was still alive? And in believing that, I'm not saying the resurrection was hoaxed in some way or was faked in any way. I think it would still be genuine. I just think it can still have happened within the realms of modern day our understanding of biology, and it wouldn't have required a complete death. It would have required death-like symptoms. Maybe Jesus sunk into a coma, but he was revived and was able to then carry on after the crucifixion and continue his mission.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So just to confirm a couple things, that was a great answer, very thorough. You covered a lot of my follow-ups. So one thing, so you would take the view that in general, people die on crucifixion through asphyxiation. You kind of take, that's how they die type thing. Okay. Cool. And that's why in Jesus' case, it should take more of a longer time type deal. One little probing thing is with that chest wound. Because I do think you're right. It is possible that people could survive crucifixion. There's obviously the issue of scourging. How would that have played a role? Yep. But with the chest wound, you were kind of saying it's like a little probe, but then wouldn't like you're admitting there's also like blood and water, which indicates kind of a more deeper penetration. So that, yep. Like, how do you kind of make sense of that? That's the only.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So first I would say I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical person. So I'm relying on what others have said. Mm-hmm. And again, you will get medical doctors of a Christian persuasion arguing one way, and you would get other doctors of a different persuasion arguing it differently. But I've heard medical explanations for how they've actually gone even to the other extreme. I've heard one medical explanation saying actually that wound in the chest would actually have helped him live, because if liquid was building up in his lungs through pleurisy, which is when liquid does build up, which can happen through a traumatic experience. One doctor was telling me, he goes, look, in A&E, when someone comes in with this kind of thing, the first thing we do is we drain the lung. And he was like, I've done that. He's like, I've done that procedure many times. We puncture on the side and we remove the liquid to help avoid them basically suffocating in a way. So it's hard to prove for us, really difficult for us to get into it. All I can really say is that I've seen it argued multiple ways. So I've seen those who've said that actual side wound may have actually helped relieve liquid that was building up in the lung and might actually have been something that helped him survive. He was certainly injured deeply. Like, that would have been, he bled. We'll get onto the shroud, I know, but the shroud is soaked in blood. So it's a traumatic experience. But I've heard doctors say that when you're nailed on the cross, for example, the points of where you are nailed and suspended, you're not knocking out any major blood vessels in the body. So I would say it's still plausible that you could have had that and be tortured in the other ways and still have survived with the right medical help, with the right herbs and other balms being applied to you. But there would be some lasting side effects, right? He would still have wounds. He would still be in pain. And what I find really interesting is if you read the New Testament accounts and you sort of, and I know it's hard to do this, if you try and strip away some of the religious narrative and the dogma around Jesus, around Prophet Jesus and what happened after the crucifixion, the first time he's recognized by Mary Magdalene, I believe it is, many Marys, I think it's Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
When she recognizes who he is and she goes to embrace him, he says, please don't touch me. Now, I know there's a Christian interpretation to say, well, it's a resurrected body, he's in a special state. But actually, if he was just in pain from what he's been through, that response of his also makes sense to me. And when he does meet the disciples afterwards, they're able to, doubting Thomas is able to put his hands inside the wounds and see those wounds. So I think the wounds are very much real. They would have affected him. It would have taken him a while to recover. He needed attention. And I think Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were the ones that provided that assistance and help. But I think over that period of days, they were able to nurse him back to life. sort of, or help him recover from his wounds, I should say. And he was able to then be well enough to present himself to his disciples and meet them a few times afterwards as well.
Gotcha, gotcha. All right, cool. The other follow-up, the other thing that's going to be shocking to a lot of listeners and stuff is this notion that Jesus went to India.
Yes.
As Christians, we're like, what? I want to probe on that. Like, is there any historical evidence for or against that? Like,
Yeah.
what's the evidence for this, basically?
So let's start with let's start with what happened immediately after the crucifixion to try and work out, what happened next, really. So the way, so again, I understand there's a difference of opinion. The way, if I look at the post-crucifixion sightings of Jesus, first of all, let me deal with that. I mean, I think there is no doubt that he was alive and seen by his followers after the crucifixion event. I don't believe that the Christian faith would have had such an effect on people. It would have lasted thousands of years if that resurrection was only something metaphorical, or if those post-crucifixion sightings were just metaphorical, or they were just dreams or visions. I don't feel Christianity would have been able to be born and has survived as long as it is. So I believe those people, those disciples, they saw Jesus again physically, to the point where they were absolutely clear who he was and that it wasn't an apparition. And partly that's because Jesus himself, I believe, as the New Testament says, literally said, "Come and touch my hands and see that I'm real. I'm not a ghost. I am actually real." I think if you look at his behavior afterwards, though, he meets with his disciples in secret. Even when he meets them, he says, "Look, let's not talk here. Let's meet further away." He's in hiding in a way. He's keeping a low profile. He's arranging meetings with them in specific locations. He's not, for example, going back out to the Sadducees and the Pharisees and saying, "You tried, look at me. I've resurrected, and your efforts have failed, and this is proof that I am, the Messiah, or I am Son of God, or beyond that." He doesn't do that. He actually doesn't seem to do that. And people in the post-crucifixion sightings, you also hear people not recognizing him originally as well.
Mm-hmm.
So again, different interpretations. One interpretation would be he's basically traveling, incognito. He's trying to keep a low profile. Maybe he's even disguised in some ways in terms of, the way he's dressed or appearing. At one point he's mistaken for a gardener. It sounds consistent with, again, if we try and remove some of the dogma, which is so hard to do, I know. If you look at it in almost everyday terms, and the fact that he's on the move, it seems consistent with him trying to get away from that area, trying to escape from the area, saying, "Look, they tried to kill me. I managed to survive. Now I need to move on." And if you look at the Roman Empire, where Palestine was and is, it was on the very eastern edge of the Roman Empire. So if he's trying to get out of the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire, he's on the edge anyway. He doesn't have to travel too far. He was able to do that, and his travel direction would be to the east. Now, if we think about, St. Paul meeting Jesus. Now, let's imagine as well, what if that wasn't a vision? What if he physically did meet him on the road to Damascus? So you start to plot out the different points where we're hearing these post-crucifixion sightings. There is a general trend, I would say, moving towards the east. So that's one interesting observation. The second thing to talk about is what was the mission of Jesus? Now, he says in the New Testament, and again, I can maybe caveat everything with I'm saying, I know there's different viewpoints. One interpretation is he talks about the lost tribes of Israel, or the tribes of Israel, or the lost tribes, lost sheep of the tribes of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They said that I've only been sent unto the lost tribes, the sheep of the house of Israel. Now, there were 12 tribes of Israel, and at the time he was at Jesus's time, only 2 of them remained in Palestine because the others had been scattered. The Assyrians, I think it was in the 8th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar came, and the Israelites were scattered a long distance. We don't really know where they went, but there are traditions, and again, this is debated, and it's hard to unpick the history. There are people and there are traditions and there are communities that have claimed to be descendants of those lost tribes. Some of them have gone as far as maybe even China, but there are definitely those that are in the east, in Kashmir, Afghanistan, modern day sort of India, Pakistan, those kind of areas, Iraq, Iran. Those kind of areas have people who have often claimed that they are descendants of these tribes. One of my co-workers at the Review of Religions, she's a medical doctor, and she did she wrote an article recently around genetic similarities between some of the tribes or people who claim to be descendants of the Jewish tribes in India, along with Jews that are living in Israel at the moment. So there are studies to kind of go, actually, there's some interesting parallels between these groups. Yes, they've got their traditions, they've got their own stories about their lineage, but also there's some specific medical things as well that seem to suggest that they may be descendants of those lost tribes in those far off places. So if somehow Jesus was aware of this, and if he had stated his mission was to preach to the lost tribes, that may have been what he did afterwards. He may have thought, okay, I've preached to these tribes, I've been rejected by my people here. I now need to go on and continue preaching to the others who have not heard my voice, and they are in these other far off lands. So he would have traveled on to then have done that. In sort of different historical records, and these get quite sketchy because it's hard to kind of put this story together. I feel like even now we have an outline, we have a few hints that this may have happened, but we're far from proving that Jesus went to India or that he traveled here. But there are historical texts from areas, and there are communities who have talked about traditions of a prophet teaching a message of peace. One Hindu tradition, there's a book in the Hindu tradition called the Bhagavad Mahapurana. It talks about a meeting between a king and a saintly figure in India, where that saintly figure was dressed in white. He claimed to be born of a virgin. He said that he taught a religion of peace, that he had been exiled from his homeland, and that he had traveled here to preach here instead. And he went on to preach to the king, explaining that his message is that of love. So there's hints, it's almost, we're teased with certain sources in different areas that talk about a figure that seems to match the figure of Prophet Jesus. Now, could it have been a disciple of Jesus? Could it be, there are other explanations for who was this saintly figure, but the person seems to have this claim to be Jesus, taught in parables as well, and their references and their points along this possible route to India, in different regions, such as Taxila in modern-day Pakistan. There's a tribe in Afghanistan who claim that their lineage is actually from Jesus himself. So Jesus may have had children as well. So there's these traditions and there's these legends. And I guess what makes this topic fascinating for me and others is that, we're still exploring these areas, right? There's very few people that are looking for a post-crucifixion life of Jesus, first of all, because the orthodox teaching in Christianity and Islam is that, he ascended to heaven. So there's very few looking for it anyway. But those of us that are, we find little bits of information in different places. And the last 20 or 30 years, I would say, there's been tens of books. There's been at least 3 or 4 sort of major documentaries as well that have tried to uncover this story. One by the Discovery Channel, one by the BBC in the UK, and one I was involved in by Paul Davies, an independent filmmaker, trying to piece together that tradition. So there are hints and there's small elements, and there are texts that talk about this. And there's also a physical tomb. So there is a tomb in Kashmir, which has a very interesting claim. So it's got 2 figures in there. One is an Islamic Muslim saint, and the other is a figure known as Yus Asaf, is the name of this person. And he's a very, who he is very controversial. Even the Muslims today. So the orthodox position of Islam is that Jesus is in the heavens and will return later. So even today, within Islam, you won't find many Muslims that will believe in this tomb. The owners of the tomb right now are Muslim caretakers that basically looking after it. And it's really interesting for me to hear what their thoughts are on the tomb. So when it's told to them, who is in this tomb, is it Jesus? They'll firstly deny it. They'll be like, no, this is not Jesus. Then they'll start saying, oh, no, it is a prophet. It's someone, the person in this tomb is a prince prophet. He came from another land. He traveled, some mentioned he came from Egypt. He traveled to this area and, he's buried here. But, he's one of the Muslim prophets. Now, that doesn't fit correctly with Islamic theology. There is no concept really of other Muslim prophets. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is believed by Muslims to be the final, prophet. That's one reason they're so against the Ahmadiyya claim, for example. So the position of modern day owners of that tomb is confused as well, because they've got a conflict in their own mind, because as far as they're concerned, Prophet Jesus is in the heavens. But also they do talk about this tradition of this prophet buried in this tomb, and they talk of a story of him, escaping some kind of persecution in a land and moving here, to Kashmir. One interesting aspect of that tomb is the direction of it as well. So the direction of the tomb is basically the direction in which the Jews bury their dead as well. It's a specific direction, and I believe it's east-west facing, whereas the Islamic tradition is to bury them in a different direction, north-south facing. So we have a Jewish prophet born who's buried in there, who traditions locally say that he claimed to be Yus Asaf, and other traditions have said that he claimed to be the same prophet from Israel, prophet Jesus. So this is the kind of the pieces of the jigsaw that have been put together. It still needs more research and more evidence, more conclusive evidence, more evidence that can be dated further back. I don't think it's a proven case completely, but it's a fascinating topic. And there's people who have written about this topic from many different faith traditions. Buddhists, you have Holger Kirsten, who's a German theologian as well. You have those who are maybe even of no faith particular, or even of a Christian background. Suzanne Olsen is an example of that, who's also spoken about this tomb. So I'm not going to say that it's proven completely. I'd say this is one theory. I would say from a faith point of view, from an Ahmadiyya Muslim theology point of view, we do firmly believe that Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, has died a natural death. He is dead and buried somewhere on earth. And that tomb is the theory put forward now as the best possibility we can put out there. I know how jarring it is when people first hear this theory. I know how outlandish and crazy it sounds. But when you start to piece together the bits of information, you can see maybe it's not as outlandish as it sounds. The last thing I'll say about travel is, the old spice route or the Silk Route actually connected, Palestine to China, essentially. So travel between those parts of the world was more frequent than we may realize, and was more well established than we might realize, just because there was a spice route there anyway, where there was more interconnection than we think. So just from a physical view, how would you travel that far? It was a journey that was done by many people from a trade point of view. So those are kind of the pieces of the puzzle that have been put together to try and argue this as a thesis. It's still being researched right now. Like I said, there's articles and books coming out all the time, and I hope more will be done, because I think when the bigger the claim that someone makes, the higher the bar needs to be in terms of the evidence to prove it. So I think there's still a lot of evidence that needs to be presented. But then I would say belief of a physical ascension to the heaven is that's a huge claim as well. That's hard to prove as well. And so that's kind of how we've got to this theory, and this is how for me personally as well, I find that more realistic than an ascension.
So that's interesting that you said theologians from different backgrounds have studied the tomb, for example. And
yeah,
out of curiosity, do you know if secular archaeologists have studied it? I'm sort of curious. Have they dated the tomb, as well as these, like, when do these texts date from?
Exactly. So a lot of the texts are more like medieval in their timing. So that's one.
Okay.
One weakness in the theory, right? We have the Bhavisya Mahapurana, which claims to have a dating of, say, 120 AD, but then we also know over time there have been changes, and versions have changed. There's been manipulation to that text. So it's hard to say that we have authentic sources dating way back. A lot of the traditions that people rely on around who Yus Asaf was are 17th century, 16th century. They're not ancient. So it's hard, it's complicated to try and put together a really solid timeline of that. In terms of your question about, who does this research, and I think we have the same challenge with the Shroud. It's like those who are of less of a religious background, they're less inclined to do this. Like if you were to look at, even Shroud researchers, right, they'll nearly always be coming at it from a specific angle. We're so lucky and blessed to have Barrie Schwortz, who I've had I'm fortunate to get to know, because he is genuinely objective, because he said, I come from a Jewish background. I'm not trying to prove something from this. So but if you look at the other researchers who have written about the book, written books, about the topics of a post-crucifixion life, but all of Jesus, and also the Shroud, it tends to be those who have a specific agenda. And let me be honest, I count myself in that category, right? If I wasn't an Ahmadiyya Muslim who was brought up with this tradition, for whom this is a really key part of my faith, You know, why would I be that interested in digging into this topic? So it's a nature of the problem, really, that these topics are theological in their essence, and genuinely it attracts people from a theological background. And then when someone who's not theological, you know, when you ask them, like, I've been involved in proposals for films, documentaries, etc., on these topics, like, why would someone want to get involved in something this controversial? Sometimes they will. You have the exceptions, but often it's like, well, you know, I don't want to get involved in something that is going to be so emotive and that causes so much controversy. You will get some people who will, and they'll be comfortable with that. But then it's, you know, it's really hard to attract people. So I also would like what you just said, you know, a humanist, maybe an atheist, someone of no faith whatsoever, who has no emotional connection or theological connection to the shroud and to the tomb in Kashmir, to actually go in and date them. I think the challenge is, and this is, I don't know what to think about this, maybe this is just the way life is, but it's so frustrating that today in 2022, we have this alleged tomb in Kashmir and we have this relic, you know, in the Shroud of Turin. Access to both of those for very different reasons, but access is so complex on both accounts. If doing additional tests is so difficult. In Kashmir, it's more political. It's more about, you know, is it a safe part of the world to send a crew to, you know, who would want to travel there? It's in an unsafe area, unfortunately. But then also, because the Ahmadiyya community, who is seen as heretical, because they have talked about this tomb, you know, those who own the tomb and other Orthodox Muslims are so against any research in there around this tomb. They don't want anyone coming and even thinking that this is the tomb of Jesus. They have a sign placed on top of the tomb now, in front of the building, clearly saying the Quran and the Bible agree that Jesus is in heaven. There's no reason this tomb is the tomb of Jesus. That's something that's been put in the last sort of 10 years. So there are so many barriers of, sadly, annoyingly, frustratingly, so many barriers to go in and do this research. But, you know, I would love for someone to do that. And I don't want that to be an Ahmadiyya Muslim. I want that to be someone who can really be objective and can kind of do it in a way where, you know, they can kind of give some real credibility to the whole process, not just the outcome of the process, to kind of show that it was done in an objective way. I hope that day will come, but it's, you know, I'm as frustrated around the tomb as I am around the lack of additional tests on the shroud as well. You know, from that point of view, it's sadly, it's just really difficult at the moment to test either artifact.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm 100% with you. I share that frustration when it comes to, I want to investigate everything. Truth is,
Sure,
all
absolutely.
truth is God's truth, right? So
Yeah.
I'm with you on that. And all right, not a problem. What one last follow up on this, and it's something you kind of hinted at in your answer on this Jesus traveling to India issue. You mentioned, well, maybe it's disciple, and
Yeah.
there's some people who say, well, the Apostle Thomas traveled to India.
Exactly.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw it open to you. Like, what are your thoughts on Thomas traveling to India, and do you think there could be a conflation based on the evidence, or like what's your
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's even more interesting when some people have said that the disciple Thomas was, some have referred to him as almost, I think he was referred to as the twin, not literal twin, but, you know, there's even elements in the New Testament that say they look like each other. So I do believe Thomas did travel to India, and actually that adds credence or adds credibility to the argument about travel like that did occur, you know, in the ancient world. And, you know, it's not that we had to wait until we had aeroplanes before we could do that kind of travel. So I do believe Thomas went to India. And I think that gives support to the plausibility of Jesus having traveled as well. Now, so the real question is that what makes it special? What can we tie from that tomb to Jesus specifically? So one would be the claim that he said that he was a prophet traveling from another land. So one would be that, which again is through tradition, oral traditions, written documents, but not dating back thousands of years, maybe a few hundred years, but they do exist. And then the other would be, again, we're teased with this. So next to the tomb, it's enclosed with a glass building. There's a sarcophagus at ground level. The tombs are underground. At ground level, in and around the tomb, and we don't know the date of this, we don't know when this was placed near the tomb, but there are some carved footprints. There's some feet carvings that are placed right next to the tomb. And the BBC 4 documentary called Did Jesus Die does a really good job of showing those feet carvings and showing the marks on the feet, which I'll get into, and explaining why this may be a link to Jesus.
Not to interrupt, but
Sure,
are
please.
those documentaries? Because I'd like to post them on my blog for
Oh,
people.
absolutely.
Are they
Yeah,
on?
I'll definitely send them to you. They are online, so you can get a hold of them, and they're really worth watching as well. I had the fortune to meet. So the BBC 4 one was done by a gentleman called Richard Denton. I was lucky enough not just meet him, but a couple of times that me and him went to. We had Q&A panels at 2 different universities in London, and what we would do is we would play his documentary in a university, invite anyone who was interested around this documentary and the question of did Jesus die on the cross. And then afterwards, we had a question and answer session as well with the audiences. So I got to do that twice with him. A really interesting guy. So yeah, I'll absolutely share those links with you. These footprints, and again, I wish there was a way to date them. They're impressions, they're carvings made in stone. Now, feet carvings or footprints are really common in India. If you think about Buddhist tradition, there's often, these carvings, feet carvings are seen a lot of the time. But there's something unusual about these feet carvings, and that is that on the front of the feet, and the video does a good job of showing this, there's 2 marks, or what appears to be marks or scars, or elevated areas towards the feet, towards the end, the toes of the person. Now, on the left foot and the right foot, and these are stone carvings that have been made by someone, left foot and the right foot have this kind of scar, but they're not in the same position. On one foot, they're higher up the foot than on the other one. Now, what researchers have said, and to be honest, it's a bit of a leap, but what they've said is that actually, if those were crucifixion scars, and if the person who was creating that stone sculpture of the feet was trying to indicate, maybe they were trying to indicate that there's something unusual about this person, and maybe that was a way to preserve who that person was. The idea is that that person creating this sculpture would have carved these feet and placed these marks on the feet. And they say that the feet, the carvings, the scars on the top of the feet do not match on the left and the right, but they would align if one foot was placed on the other. And on the BBC 4 documentary, they do a great job in the culmination of the documentary. I don't want to spoil it for people, but they basically do a 3D reconstruction to say, look, there's 2 scars, different positions in the feet. They wouldn't align, but if one foot was placed on top of the other and something like a nail was put through both feet, a single nail, then the scars would align. Now, there's a lot of debate about how Jesus was placed on the cross. Was he nailed through the feet? Was it through the heels, etc.? So this is all very speculative and controversial. But on that documentary, what they speculate and they say is that, look, that whoever created this carving was trying to demonstrate, show something unique, a specific characteristic about the person in that tomb. And these are the feet carvings, and these marks on there are consistent with someone who survived a crucifixion. So if we then say it's a prophet, traveled from Egypt, he claimed to be a prophet, he taught in parables, and also he had crucifixion-like wounds on his feet, then that narrows it down, and that kind of makes it more plausible that this is actually that of Jesus himself and not a disciple. So that would be that is the argument for saying it is actually the tomb of Jesus. And the fact it's revered so much and visited, even the Muslims who do not believe it's the tomb of Jesus, they still will come and pray and present flowers and other offerings they will venerate this tomb still. And that's been their tradition from their ancestors. So they still hold it in great veneration. So if you put all of those together, it starts to build a case. Again, I don't think it's a watertight case. I think more evidence is needed. Of course, like I said, with an extraordinary claim comes an extraordinarily high bar for evidence. But there's enough there for there to be a few documentaries and some more research on this. And I hope that continues. Because, like you, I want to know, as much as you do about the truth of these kind of claims. And if it's not truth, if it's not the right tomb, that's fine. I'd rather know one way or the other.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, at this point, let's get to the point I think that the audience has been waiting for. Obviously, your views on the Shroud of Turin. So, first of all, I just want to kind of get what's the history of the involvement of Ahmadiyya Muslims in general with the Shroud, and then obviously, what's your position on the Shroud of Turin?
So it's a really interesting topic, because if you had asked, if we were speaking maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would be a looser connection between the community and the Shroud. I don't believe there's the founder of the community didn't talk about the Shroud in 1890s, because although the Shroud had been photographed by Secondo Pierre, news of the Shroud hadn't reached him. He doesn't speak about it specifically. So it's not a core part of our faith or belief, really. But what has happened is when the analysis has happened to the Shroud, there have been those who have written about does the shroud prove that Jesus survived the crucifixion? Now, I know that there are more who have written about, does the shroud prove that Jesus died and was resurrected? But there was evidence in the 70s, the 80s around, people were starting to research. They'd seen what Stirp was saying about the shroud, and they were speculating around, could it help us learn more about the events of the crucifixion? Now, like I was saying earlier, for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community believes that Jesus survived the crucifixion as a human being. He was nursed back to health, and then he continued his mission. So for us, more than so than other Muslims, if you take the Orthodox viewpoint from an Islamic point of view, that actually Jesus was saved from crucifixion, he was never put on the cross, well, then the shroud has zero significance or interest. If you don't even believe he was crucified, then the man of the shroud might be someone, we don't even know who that would be from an Orthodox Islamic viewpoint. But if, as Ahmadiyya Muslims, you believe that he survived the crucifixion, then the shroud potentially is a really interesting piece of evidence that may help us understand what actually happened. In terms of a direct link with the community, what was fascinating was that when the shroud was exhibited, I believe in 2010, the current caliph of our community, really coincidentally, I was fortunate enough to be able to just have a sit-down chat with the president of our community in Italy. And over a coffee, he was just sharing with me the coincidences of what took place that allowed our Khalifa, his name is Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the current head of the community, to actually end up viewing the shroud in Turin, which he did. So there were a number of strange coincidences. He was traveling, he had a travel plan across Europe anyway. He was visiting different countries, and 2 or 3 different things came together, which allowed this opportunity to come about for him to not only see the shroud, but also, have a private audience with the director of the shroud exhibition, Monsignor Gilberti. So this audience was brought about. There's a video online, which I'm happy to share with you as well. If there's a sit-down discussion between the current head of the Ahmadiyya community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, and Monsignor Gilberti, who organized the shroud exhibition, and also someone from the sort of the Islamic expert within the group at the time as well, from the Christian side. They're kind of Islamic spokesman, if you like, or more of an expert on different types of Islamic belief. And they had a really interesting dialogue as well. They ended up focusing on the commonality was around, look at the suffering Jesus went through. That was something that all of us can kind of agree on. And look at the suffering people go through for their faith and for their belief and love of God. That was what they ended up kind of coming together on, because at the start there was an acknowledgement that actually, your community believes Jesus traveled to India. Yes, we do. You have a different response about what happened at the crucifixion. Yes, we do. But that was what they kind of came together on. But so that was the first time. That was the first time that any living, leader of the community was able to visit the shroud. So the current caliph, he is the worldwide head. He is our figurehead. He's our equivalent of the Pope. He actually got to see the shroud directly, at that exhibition. And following on from that led to more interest within the community about the shroud. And also it led to, the Review of Religions magazine I'm involved in and I write for, us picking up the topic again and, writing again about the shroud. And it was doing that kind of refresh of the shroud research we had before that we got back in touch with Barrie Schwortz, and we said, hey, Barrie, we'd spoken to you, you had submitted articles for this magazine before. How about we do a refreshed one? We've noticed you've got something on your website. Can we reprint that? Can you help us with doing an edition on the shroud? And that, kind of got the momentum going again around the whole topic of the Shroud of Turin and the Ahmadiyya community. So the community doesn't have, generally we believe in the authenticity of it. It's not an article of faith. It's not critical to our belief system, really. But given that we believe Jesus survived the crucifixion, we believe the shroud is like a key piece of evidence potentially, and a sort of a tantalizing clue, or a way of viewing what went on during the crucifixion. And, potentially, does it give us a clue about what happened after that? Was there a resurrection, for example? Was there a corona discharge or some kind of burst of radiation? The shroud gives us that kind of window into this world. And that's why the community are interested in it. But, for me personally, what fascinated me was, this is something that you could touch and feel and hold, if you're lucky enough to, metaphorically, let's say, and analyze and scrutinize. So up until now, a lot of what we talked about, Dale, in terms of what happened at the crucifixion, etc., to answer that, normally we would have to study specific texts. We'll be looking at different codices. What was the oldest version we have of this gospel and that gospel, and how authentic is it? How was it? What was the chain of narration? Maybe how was it named? What year does it date from? It's very much scriptural analysis. What the Shroud potentially gives you, the chance to do is to actually a physical object that we can potentially ask questions to and maybe get answers. So it gives you that opportunity to maybe move this on from talking about scripture and text to actually a physical object. Now, I know that there's probably more views on the Shroud than there are on the New Testament now, but it at least gives you the possibility of trying to delve into an actual object to try and understand, what went on. So that's kind of the background of the community. And the last thing I'll say is, and we can get into more detail, is from 2015 until COVID started, and we had exhibitions on the Shroud of Turin. So we had our community, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has an annual gathering in the UK that attracts about 40,000 different people. It is over 3 days. It is both for our own members to come together and meet their friends and colleagues from other countries, but also it's an event that we invite guests, dignitaries, and like members of parliament, government, kings, and other leaders from different countries, but also researchers as well. And one thing we started to do in 2015, I believe it was we did an exhibition around the Shroud of Turin, and we started to Barrie Schwortz came along to that exhibition as well. He spoke at it, and we've started that tradition of having these annual Shroud exhibitions, and that's deepened the interest within the community itself and its own members with the Shroud, and it's led to a really interesting collaboration, with different Catholic groups, with the Shroud of Turin, British Shroud of Turin Society in the UK. I've been in touch with many of them. I know them, their members personally now, and so that's another thing, that the community has started this exhibition, and it's become one of the largest. Strange for me to even say this, but I think it was recognized as the largest Shroud exhibition outside of Turin. Is actually, arguably this convention at a Muslim event, where we've had Barrie Schwortz come every year. Again, pre-COVID, we hope to start again from next year. But we had sort of 5 years in a row where he was coming, and he also brought others with him, and we were able to discuss and debate the Shroud and all the different viewpoints. We would also have a skeptic come along who doesn't believe in its authenticity at all, Hugh Ferry, who thinks it is a medieval forgery. So we had a whole range of opinions. So the community has started to get more interested, I would say, in the last few years as well.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I definitely will congratulate you on those expositions, because I've talked to Barry behind the scenes. That's like one of his favorite things. His favorite line from that is, here I am, a Jew, presenting about a Christian relic to a bunch of Muslims. So
yeah, I love that. Barry basically entered, immortality into Ahmadiyya tradition with that. Even those who didn't know what the Shroud was and hadn't visited the exhibition, because they heard his little line was delivered to the entire audience of the convention, and he spoke just a few minutes before one of the major keynotes by our caliph. So a lot of people around the world as well listened to that. So everyone knew who Barry was after he said that famous line about a Jewish man at a Christian talking about Christian relic to a Muslim audience.
Awesome. All right, cool. Okay, so kind of getting into it here then. So you kind of hinted at this, right? So obviously the Shroud of Turin isn't just a burial cloth, it has these images on it. And obviously they have various physical and chemical characteristics that Stirp has proven. And I think you guys would more or less agree with all those features. But beyond that, I also want to ask you, how are those images formed? What do Ahmadiyya Muslims or yourself think about that?
Absolutely. So I would say from an Ahmadiyya Muslim point of view, I'll tell you the major theories they're backing, then I'll give you my personal opinion as well, which is mostly in line. So again, Holger Kirsten is a figure that comes up a lot. So Holger Kirsten, controversial German theologian, he wrote a book called The Jesus Conspiracy. Now, I don't agree with the conclusions of that book, because he was trying to say that the carbon dating was deliberately skewed on purpose to try and discredit the Shroud, because the Shroud proves Jesus survived the crucifixion. I personally don't think that's what's happened. I think the carbon dating, which we can talk about, I think it's sometimes we have a really elaborate explanation. Sometimes it can be very simple. I think it was a rewoven section of the cloth, which is why the dates are skewed. That's the theory I tend towards. But what Holger Kirsten did in that book was he said that, look, if you take the aloe and the myrrh, those herbs that we know about, they're mentioned in the gospel, they're mentioned in large quantities as well. If we take those herbs and we create a particular type of ointment or mixture that we believe, that Ahmadiyya Muslims as well believe, would have been placed on Jesus to try and help heal him. If you take those herbs and you cover a body with those herbs, and then you place that person, and there's a photo vividly etched in my mind, a picture of Holger Kirsten himself, draping a linen cloth over him, lying next to a radiator, and lying with the cloth. Yeah. An image of some kind can form on that cloth, which has some of the characteristics of what we see on the shroud. The founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, when he wrote Jesus in India, the book, he also talked about traditions, saying that there's this ointment known as the ointment of Jesus. And he talked about how it contains aloe and myrrh and some other different chemicals and substances. And so what he talked about that and said, this is something that would have been applied to Jesus. And he mentioned different medical books of history that talk about this ointment. So what researchers have done on the Ahmadiyya side is they've taken that ointment, they've created it, and they've tried to say, look, if we take I think they took a young child, they took a youngster, we put that ointment on him. Does it leave some kind of impression on the linen cloth? If the body is warm, and if that person is perspiring and there is heat there, can it lead to some kind of image? And it does, from what I've seen, it does. However, so that's the Ahmadiyya Muslim view, would be that it was some kind of natural reaction between the herbs, the mixture, the herbal mixture, the sweat on the cloth, and the sweat from the body heat, and the linen cloth.
So that's sort of the Kirsten and Gruber method, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Now, so I mean, my personal view on that is that explains part of it. But when you see the shroud, and I haven't seen the actual one, but I've seen a life-size replica based on Barrie's photos. When you see the image, the resolution of that image is incredible. It's not a blurred possible markings, etc. It's very clear. You're able to make out so much detail. So I have to say, it's a mystery, right? We don't know how that image was formed. It's still a mystery. And when you speak to Barrie as well, he will be very open in that. He was like, Stirp had one job, to explain how the image formed, and they weren't able to answer that. They collected a lot of information. They can tell you very clearly what it's not, but they're not able to come up with an image formation mechanism for that. Now, I think if you look at science, right, there's a lot of things we don't know, though. I think what my view is this: as soon as some people hear that we're not sure how this was done, others immediately jump in and say it's a miracle, this is God, or this is a resurrection, or this involved radioactivity. I think they jump too far to other conclusions sometimes, because they say, well, science can't explain it, which means it's a miracle. Now, I'm a man of God, but I'm also a man of science as well. I personally don't believe they conflict. I think the scientific method has a massive amount of value. Science doesn't know how gravity works. We don't know what particle or what mechanism is responsible for this force that goes across huge distances that's causing the Earth right now to rotate against the sun. We don't know how that is working, but that doesn't mean we need to doubt that it exists as a mechanism, and that gravity, it does exist. So I think, yes, there is a gap here. There isn't no one has recreated the shroud. No one, whether they believe in whether they believe in him having survived the crucifixion, or whether they believe in him having kind of died, or whether they believe in a resurrection, no one's been able to recreate, to my knowledge, the Shroud of Turin style image of someone that matches all the characteristics. There's some really difficult characteristics, right? The image, and you'll know this from your conversations with Barrie, the image is so superficial. It's millimeters in depth. It doesn't stain all the way through the cloth. The blood stains do, but the image is very superficial. So how, even if Holger Kirsten and others, Elman Gruber and others, are able to formulate some kind of image on a cloth, they haven't been able to present they haven't been able to produce something that matches the shroud. So first of all, I would say we don't know exactly how it formed. There are hints that there may be some natural mechanisms. There are other hints as well, and this is circumstantial, but the New Testament does talk about, at the time of Jesus bowing his head, and it does talk about potentially an earthquake or the ground shaking. So is there, does that lead to some chemicals being in the air that may have had some contribution to the image formation mechanism? Maybe. There are other theories about, radiation or corona discharge, and these other theories, right? That is a possibility. For me, it's like I said, I'm so glad we've got Barrie Schwortz, right? I'm really glad we do have him, and his background, right? And he actually believes, and I agree with him, that he's almost been chosen for this work because he's able to tread a very delicate path, but he's able to be really objective here. So, in terms of, does the resurrection, is the resurrection proved by the image on the shroud? Like, could a radiation spark have led to that image? Ask Barrie, right? And he'll say, well, actually, Ray Rogers and others have spoken about how if it was radiation, for example, that would have made changes to the cloth. The linen fibers would have physically been different. And I believe there was a paper in 2005 where Ray Rogers spoke about that, and he actually did the experiment. He exposed some linen to a corona discharge, and he kind of talked about what that would look like under the microscope, what the different characteristics are of the cloth and how it would change when it's being exposed to things like this. So I really hope that we can keep the debate on the shroud in the right realms, because the problem is this: when people start going down there was a resurrection, or the body levitated, or the body like dematerialized, and the skeptics who are already out there, and the real scientists, the really smart scientists that we want to spend time on this topic, they're going to go even further away, because they're going to see people drawing some really bold conclusions that are not justified, I believe, from a lot of the evidence. So we need to kind of I hope we can keep the discussion and debate on the shroud, in the right area where it attracts more interest, similar to the tomb in Kashmir. I want more people to be looking at this. I want it to be analyzed and studied, and I want more data to come out about the shroud. And I do worry sometimes that it's in books that I've got on my shelves here as well, there's certain, Frederick Zuckerby is a pathologist, absolutely, but some of what he wrote in his book about the shroud and the medical side of it veers more into theology, and that then means that some of his conclusions are not going to be, they're almost discredited in a way. So I hope that there will be more research done in an objective way. I hope, Stirp had a proposal for a follow-up that never happened. I hope within our lifetimes that I hope within Barry's lifetime that there will be an additional opportunity to study the shroud, to try and get more information on it, because it is a fascinating cloth, and I think it's I think that image needs explanation, right? There's currently £1 million reward put out there, by David Rolfe, who I've had a chance to meet a few times, a friend of mine, who's made films on this topic, and he's put £1 million reward for anyone who can recreate the shroud. So I hope that sparks some interest, and I hope we can learn more about what the shroud really is.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Very interesting. First of all, very good. You covered two questions at once, so that was awesome. One last follow up on this image thing, because it seems like from an Ahmadiyya Muslim perspective, regardless of whether you take it, it's a mystery, you don't know. There is a common denominator that the alloys and myrrh played some role in healing Jesus. One kind of thing, there's a finding that Stirp found where there was no detectable traces of any of these compounds on the shroud. So I just want to put it to you as kind of like a challenge. What do you make of that?
No, absolutely. I remember like as a youngster, I say that like in my 20s, emailing Barrie back in the day, talking about this. I think they're organic compounds, and organic compounds can decompose and decay over time. So I'm not an expert on that, but that's my understanding, that the absence of them right now doesn't mean that they weren't on the body of Jesus at the time. Because they're organic compounds, they are, over time, they will break down. It's a surprising finding, definitely. But yeah, that was kind of my take on it, is that we don't know, because it's been such a long period of time. There are many things that may have happened to the cloth as well. It's surprising that there aren't any. But I still think there's an element that I believe it could still be part of the mechanism, even if today, when Stirp looked at it a few years ago, in the passage of 2,000 years, things could have changed, and they could have been, those organic compounds could have broken down and not being present anymore.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Okay, so one thing I want to move on to then, and away from the science, but look, we are theologians. I'm a Christian theologian. I'm proud to be such. You're an Islamic theologian. So what is the theological significance of these images then, for your faith?
It's a really fascinating question, because I almost feel like, if I was reflecting on it just in preparation for our discussion, right? It's really, well, first of all, it's hard to say, but let me share how it's impacted my personal life, right? So I was thinking about this. The last 10 years, the Shroud, with His Holiness Al Caliph visiting the Shroud of Turin, a bridge has been formed with the Christian group and Christians, multiple different Christian groups that wouldn't have existed before. We've had the events where we've had dialogue with Catholic groups, and we've had exchanges. I've had a chance to meet Barrie Schwortz, but then also, I've had a chance to meet Bruno Barberis, who used to be, the president of the Centro, who manages the Shroud. Like, there's been a massive enrichment on a personal level, in terms of a dialogue and being able to come together with those of different faiths first and foremost, and also like just sharing information and saying it's okay to not have the same conclusion, but just actually coming together on our common belief in God, if nothing else. And in these days of where atheism is abound, even that I really enjoyed, right? Coming together with people who all believe in God and have that as a commonality and are able to come together and share what the similarities we have. So there's been an element of almost outreach. I don't know what the right word is, but it's allowed the message. It's allowed Jesus in the Shroud, or the Shroud as an object, has allowed, at least for me, to have more interaction with Christian groups than I would have had previously. It's also, I know, for those in the UK who have Pam Moon is the lady who owns the Shroud replica and this exhibition that we normally use as the basis for our exhibition. She's taken that to different churches, she's taken that to different communities, and it's through the Shroud she's been able to interact and reach people in a way that churches haven't done previously. It is visual. We're in an age where everything is visual, right? Everyone's got a camera now in their pocket nearly with their mobile phone. People like to touch and hold things. There is a higher barrier and demand for proof about things. I also find it interesting that there's also, there's scholarship out there to saying Jesus never existed as a historical figure, right? I spent my time during my studies of looking at different areas. I spent some time looking on that. I don't agree with the conclusion, but I can understand why some people can start to argue things like that. They were like, oh, where's the physical evidence? I need to see it. I don't see any physical evidence. Where is the physical evidence of Jesus Christ having existed? These relics I don't agree in, because there's so many relics claiming to be the original cross, or claiming to be part of Jesus's body or Mary's body. There's so many things. The skeptics are like, they're not going to believe that. So in that age, isn't it amazing that we're in this age, yet we now have, through the power of photography, we've uncovered this relic and we found some amazing attributes about it. That is something we can touch and hold. So maybe, and I'm speculating, I don't know, and I even think in the next 15 years, but the Shroud might take us in all sorts of directions. But right now, it is something that is a physical object. It's got this very unusual property. Science might believe they've dismissed it through the carbon dating, but I'm hoping they will revisit that. And I believe the body of evidence showing that the carbon dating is at least questionable is huge. And I think anyone who looks at it objectively will say, well, actually, we should probably try and date it again somehow. Yeah. So given all that, I'm hoping that the Shroud is a way to almost stop atheists in their ways a little bit and make them just stop and think and go, hang on a minute, maybe we need to look at this. Maybe there is something here. And maybe that's why it is coming out now in this age, where everyone is, where things are more visual, people demand proof, and belief in God is probably at an all-time low. Maybe that's why the Shroud is here right now as an object to kind of bring people closer to God. But no, I mean, I'd be speculating, as to what it really is, but that might be what it's all about. It might be saying, look, science and religion are not as incompatible as you might think. Here is some physical evidence Jesus actually existed. And here's something that maybe science, you think you have all the answers, but you can't even explain how this image formed. Maybe it is for that reason. Maybe it's to make them stop and think and ponder a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. There's people I have atheists in this audience. How many times? Yeah. Where's the scientific evidence? Well, here you go. God's giving you something, All right, cool. All right. One quick follow up on that, and I should have asked this before, but one thing that I'm curious about is just in general, from an Ahmadiyya Muslim perspective, what kind of perspective would you take on other religions or something like that? Like, are you an exclusivist or a pluralist? What are Ahmadiyya Muslims on that front?
Yeah, so to start with on that, I would say it's the first question is, like, what does Islam say about other faiths? Now, Some will say because Islam came later on, it came in the 7th century, because of that, it's got the luxury to be able to look back and talk about other faiths with authority. So even if you don't believe the message of Islam was, say, God inspired, if it was man-made, even then, the person in that view, in that scenario, Islam has an unfair advantage, if you like, because it can talk about previous religions and it can kind of put them in context, whereas Christianity couldn't have talked about Islam really. Having said that, what I find fascinating is, so first of all, what I would say is that I was born up and raised a Muslim, and so the tradition I learned first, which I think is important, was the Islamic tradition. But even in the Islamic tradition, like Christianity and Judaism are mentioned so many times in terms of them coming from God. So the true Islamic faith, true Islamic teaching is all prophets are from God. Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. All of these prophets are prophets of God. They all represented, all of them were prophets. Prophets are God's representative on the earth at that time. Each of them was sent to a specific people, nation, or area of the world, and with a specific message. The final verse of the Holy Quran, we believe the Quran was direct revelation of God. The very final verse says that, today I have completed my favor upon you, meaning the revelation of the Quranic, of the Quran, and I've named your religion Islam. So Islam is seen as like the culmination of religious evolution, and the final installment, if you like, of this teaching. And it builds upon the same teaching for the previous religions. And the Islamic viewpoint would be, where there is a difference of opinion, where there are beliefs in other religions that are incompatible, that's because over time things have changed, or there's different responses to those messages, different interpretations, and that's led to these differences. Whereas actually the ultimate truth is one, and there is one truth that is expressed in all these different religions in different ways. So that's not some new age thinking. That is like core what the Quran actually says. And I'd just like to quote a verse on that as well, if I may, if I can just find it in my notes. Just wanted to make sure I get it absolutely accurate. 1 second. I think I sent this to you earlier on as well, and I'm struggling to find it in my notes, but I will paraphrase. So the verse talks about how that the Christians and the Jews and the Sabians, it talks about, and it says, those who believe in God and do good works and believe in the last day, on them shall come no fear, nor shall they grieve. So it's basically saying that there is no monopoly on salvation, if you like, want of a better word. To get into heaven, and which Muslims do believe in an afterlife, to get into, and they believe that's the ultimate goal, to obtain heaven, to get into heaven, it's not exclusive to one specific group or sect, or one specific schism or religion. Ultimately, we are all individually accountable to God. Ultimately, each of us has a different experience. If someone's grown up in a Jewish tradition and they've not had interactions with Muslims or other faiths, then can we expect them to have, should they be judged in a way that, well, Islam is true and you didn't accept it, that means you can't be accepted into heaven? That doesn't make sense. And the God of the Quran, if you want to use that term, doesn't say that. He says basically everyone will be judged based on their actions, and everyone's deeds are judged based on their intentions as well, right? We don't know the intentions of some people as well. They may be doing things that are wrong or incorrect or not in keeping with others' faiths, but they may be doing it because they believe it's true themselves. So ultimately, only God can judge. There's no guarantee in Islam that if you are a Muslim or if you follow this tradition or that you are guaranteed heaven. Each individual is responsible for their own actions. Muslims pray 5 times a day, and I think in total something like 33 times a day they pray to be guided. We pray that guide us to God, guide us on the right path. The path of those on whom you bestowed blessings, not the path of those who've gone astray, nor the path of those who have incurred displeasure. That is repeated multiple times through the Islamic prayer. 33 times a day, Muslims are praying that prayer. So there is the viewpoint that yes, Islam makes the claim to be direct revelation from God and a true religion. It affirms and it it kind of builds upon the previous religions we've had, but it also corrects them as well. So, the Quran does highlight things around the status of Jesus, whether he was a son of God in some way, his status, and the Quran does give teachings that are contrary to core Christian teaching. It does say that he was not the son of God. It does reject things such as the Trinity, and it does say that he died a natural death, and that he was a messenger and a prophet rather than part of God or part of a Trinity. So it does make claims counter to other religions, but again, like I said, the vast majority of it, though, really does match a lot of the teachings of Christianity and Judaism in particular, but also all faiths as well. And the last thing I'll say is that there was, where the Ahmadiyya Muslim community comes in, is that there were prophecies at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he told his followers. He said there will come a time when nothing will be left of the faith of Islam except its name. He said the Quran will be wrapped up and kept nicely adorned in bookshelves, and it will be kept in boxes, but the knowledge of the Quran would be lost, the true knowledge. And he also said that, the mosques would be full of worshippers, but their prayers wouldn't be reaching God. And the Ahmadiyya community is, the advent of the founder of our community, we believe, is because, Islam is in this time when it's struggling. It's really struggling. And the whole purpose of the advent of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who founded the Ahmadiyya community, was to revive the religion, was to bring it back to its true roots, was to, make the message, almost in the way Jesus did, make the message more personal, focus it back on areas of peace and love and harmony, and highlight and emphasize those aspects more, and try and bring people, Muslims in particular, back to the true essence of their faith. Like the community's motto is love for all, hatred for none. And I think that's something that the world definitely needs more of, and something everyone can kind of get behind in terms of a way to try and improve the world right now, because the Muslim world right now is struggling. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is the community is blessed with leadership, a Khalifa, a Caliph, who everyone pledges their allegiance to and everyone is behind. And right now, the rest of the Muslim world, if there's one thing they really lack at the moment, it's a unifying voice. They lack that unity. So that is how I would see the Islamic faith and also the Ahmadiyya Muslim community's role within the sort of the world of Islam.
Interesting. I'm glad I asked that then, because it seems like you take kind of an inclusivist perspective, whereas when I read the paper you gave me, I thought you were more a pluralist. So I'm glad that you kind of clarified that. So, all right, awesome. Okay. So kind of focusing on the shroud. We've been talking about how you think it's a naturalistic explanation, both in terms of Jesus swooning and also in terms of how the images were formed.
Yep.
I want to ask you kind of a hypothetical though. Let's say, because I would argue, I think we can prove that it's supernatural, for lack of a better word, or God designed. Is how I would argue it. So let's say we do that someday, and we say, look, these images were supernaturally formed. How would that affect kind of your theology and how you interpret the shroud? Do you think that proves that Christianity would be true, or can that be accommodated into Islam and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think even the shroud itself, there was a time when I thought, finally, the shroud is going to put an end to these debates about did Jesus die or not, and it seems to have just added another aspect where there's even more debates and a range of viewpoints. So I would say, and from an Ahmadiyya Muslim point of view as well, the shroud is not central or key to the belief that Jesus survived the crucifixion and lived a post-crucifixion life, etc. That really stems more from theology and also a particular reading of the Gospels and evidence we believe. But to be really honest, it's like that we've started with the conclusion. The Ahmadiyya community stuff started with a conclusion, and then they've looked at how that can be. They've looked for evidence to see whether they can support that from other areas, and that's where the shrouds fitted in. So in reality, I think even if the shrouds, let's say there was some way we could say the shroud shows some kind of, resurrection that, radiation was involved and it was something miraculous. I don't think that would change the beliefs of the community about the position of Jesus. We would still believe him to be a prophet of God, and we wouldn't believe him to be divine in some way. I don't have an issue with saying that the image of the shroud was formed through something miraculous. I think the miraculous side, often miracles are things that we don't have an explanation for right now. So I think there's absolutely, God could have produced that image, as a sign for us in this age right now, for us to realize that actually he exists and that Jesus is someone we should study and as a person of importance. I think the viewpoint of who Jesus was and his station comes from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the revelation of the Quran, and that is seen as the key thing. So I even think, and I'm being, we are speculating here, which is fun to do. I think even if the shroud image was shown to be somehow related to, had some element of radiation and was something supernatural, I don't believe that would change the Muslims' viewpoint on who Jesus was, and that's because they would have had they would believe the Quran to be the revelation from God, and in that it's very clear around the station of where Jesus is. But it's a fascinating question, right? It's hard to predict, and I almost feel like, the deeper we get into these topics like the shroud, the more the bigger the range of responses and viewpoints on it. It's like crazy how many different viewpoints there are right now of like what the shroud is and what it represents.
Gotcha. And I'm sort of curious because one thing that I thought of, right? If again under this hypothetical that the images are supernatural kind of thing, I think a more defensible position, you could just go for a supernatural swoon theory. Great.
Yeah.
That's why it's radiation or whatever. God healed him, kind of thing, right?
Can I say as well on the swoon, right? If we look at the history of the prophets, again, if we try and look at it objectively, and with respect, if we don't think of Jesus having a unique position and we think of him as a line of prophets, there are so many traditions from different religions. Different religions where a religious prophet makes a claim and the people around him try to kill him. I mean, it happened with Prophet Muhammad as well and other prophets. And what do we see? We see that no matter what the people try against a truthful prophet, their designs are frustrated. God finds a way to save that person. God finds a way to prevent that, him from, prophet is thrown on a fire and the fire is cooled, right? So we also see the crucifixion in line with that paradigm, if you like, of an enemy goes against a chosen person of God. God finds a way to protect that person. That person prays to be saved or protected, and they are in a almost miraculous way. So that's the blueprint, if you like, that we would look at different events that prophets go through, and it's that blueprint that we would apply from an Islamic point of view, from an Ahmadiyya Muslim point of view, to the crucifixion as well. His enemies tried to kill him. They wanted to end his claims of prophet being the Messiah for the Jews. They wanted to end that claim, but he was ultimately, their designs and their plans were frustrated, and God saved him. That is the kind of the narrative we would see.
Gotcha. Okay. One thing I want to ask on the other side, because I have actually, I'm friends with Shabir Ali, who's
excellent.
like that. So, I kind of talked to him about the shroud evidence, and
what did he say?
So he was kind of getting convinced. Again, he knew nothing about it until I brought him the evidence. But finally, when I kind of got him to go, okay, maybe they are supernatural. But they're Satan. Satan did it or something. Right. So I wanted to ask you, like, would Ahmadiyya Muslims ever consider that and say maybe Satan made these things?
So really, I wondered where that came from. So first of all, Shabir Ali, fantastic debater and an amazing guy. I've not had a chance to meet him, but I've watched all his debates online and follow him on YouTube. I actually emailed him many years ago around the topic of Jesus and Prophet Jesus, because I heard him inclining a little bit towards the swoon theory in one of the answers he gave. So I said to him, well, like, you've already come halfway. If you're believing in the swoon theory, what happened next? What have you looked at the idea of Jesus traveling to India? But he was very much, I think at that time he said, look, it's a mystery. We don't know what happened to Jesus afterwards, etc. And I don't know if he still takes the viewpoint of the swoon theory. I don't know. So if he does, the Shroud of Turin should be interesting to Shabir Ali. So, but then I can understand why, if you've not already delved into this topic, he may have sort of, not been qualified, I guess, or hadn't read widely enough to have a viewpoint on it. Could it be inspired by the devil? Look, that is a possibility. It's whenever we're looking at something, there may be different sides to it, and we have to kind of question it as well. Is this, what caused this to happen? Is this something that is wholesome that we should reference, or is this something that isn't? But I personally don't see that as an argument for it. I see, like, look, we've got this image. Let's look at how, what we know about this cloth. Let's try and look at how it came about. It's been venerated. Another thing, like, we often, we overcomplicate things. Like we talk about the shroud and, it's had this long history. How do we know it's the original burial cloth? Like, well, how and why would it have survived all that time if there wasn't something special about it? If the people who were guarding it or owning it, didn't feel like this is something really special and worth guarding. Like the fact that we've had this cloth and it's existed for such a long time, to me, is another evidence that this belongs to someone really famous, so that the people who had the cloth, tried to preserve it and have preserved it as well. So I think even from that point of view, it is something that is requires an explanation. And personally, I don't think that it was created by the devil, but it's one of those, we can't really prove it. We probably can't answer that one way or the other. We can only speculate.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that kind of brings up a follow-up, if you don't mind me. That's not on the list, and I should have put this on the list. But I'm sort of curious from your perspective. Do you think that there is good historical or otherwise evidence that can link the shroud to the historical Jesus, or is it pure? It's a faith position kind of thing, or
Oh no, it's if someone believes it's not original and fake, which it may turn out to be, right? Let's see. They have to explain the characteristics of the Shroud of Turin. So Bruno Barbarius, who I mentioned earlier, used to be the president of the Centro for the Shroud, the Centre of Studies for the Shroud in Turin. He's a mathematician by background. He teaches mathematics in university. I once saw him do a calculation on the probabilities of like it not being Jesus. So I mean, he used some artistic license, but it was something along the lines of, it's someone who was crucified. That narrows it down. It's a man who was crucified. It looks like there was a crown of thorns placed upon his head. That narrows it down. We can see evidence of something that was like a crown of thorns based on the blood flows. There is a side wound in the side of the body. That would narrow it down as well. The legs are not broken. There's no broken bones. And it's something that was then preserved and it was kept, etc. So just from a probability, right? This is a cloth that shows a picture of a man who was crucified. As soon as you say that, that narrows down the time frame we're talking about. Crucifixion only ran for a few hundred years under the Romans. It wasn't generally used much beyond that, maybe in the odd occasion, but rarely. It was someone who was crucified. They had a crown of thorns placed on their head. There's evidence of a side wound. You have to explain all of these different things, like why, and it does narrow it down to a very specific, person. It's like if they weren't mocking him for claiming to be the king of the Jews, then, those people, then there would be no reason for a crown of thorns. So it had to be likely was someone who was probably claiming something like that. So none of these are absolutes. But if you piece together the evidence or what we're saying here, we're saying it was someone who was crucified. They were wrapped in a shroud. I should have mentioned that. That is a Jewish custom. So it was a Jewish person. They were wrapped in a shroud. The shroud shows a crown of thorns, a side wound, no broken bones. That cloth was preserved for centuries. We still have it today. Piece all together all of the little bits and pieces, and you start to get something that's quite compelling. So either it's genuine or it was made to look like it was genuine, and it was created in line with trying to make it in line with the gospel accounts. Like that is a possibility. I think we all have to acknowledge that is, but there are some really difficult things to explain about the characteristics of the shroud, how accurate some of the there's all sorts of studies around pollen and different things. Where was the shroud made? What's the linen type? What is the weave used? What age does that date to? Lots of little things that to me present, and there's circumstantial evidence that when grouped together provides quite a good compelling case for it to be genuine, but ultimately I don't think we can say it's been proved one way or the other, because these days proof means something specific in the scientific world, and it's quite a high barrier for saying you have actually proved something. So I think it's still still more research is needed.
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. I wanted to just ask. I was wondering about like other things, like the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's
Oh
like
yeah,
that, or Pontius Pilate.
yeah. So let's mention the Sudarium. A lot of people have never heard of it or know it even exists, right? And to them, I read a book by Mark Guskin. Again, I've had the fortune. This is to your earlier question. What has the Shroud brought me? It's brought me an opportunity to meet people like Mark Guskin and drive him around. And I've been in a car with Mark Guskin and Barrie at the same time having these discussions. I feel really blessed on that. So the Sudarium, Mark mentions in his book, research has shown that there's 150 points of correlation between the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo. Like it basically was covering the same body. Now, if the shroud is a medieval cloth from the 13th, 14th century, How does that work? We know the Sudarium has a documented history from, I think, at least the 7th century. So the Sudarium, I'm glad you brought it up. Sudarium is a really strong piece of evidence. And I think those who say it's a medieval cloth and it's a fake, they need to really explain how then the Sudarium, has these points of correlation of blood flow. Because that for me is a really strong piece of evidence that not many people know about or talk about. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Awesome. Yeah, I had Caesar Barta on my show to kind of discuss his research on
Right.
that. So, awesome. All right. All right, cool. So I'm kind of getting probing you a bit on your theology, how it would react in certain circumstances. I want to provide. There's going to be people in my audience that are going to challenge it, and they'll say,
Sure.
well, look, the Shroud of Turin, obviously, assuming it's a miracle or whatever, obviously that uniquely supports the Christian worldview. I mean, number one, you have evidence for rigor mortis in the shroud. That would prove he's dead. He didn't swoon or something. Or there's, the fact of no decomposition that kind of supports the resurrection. His body left or something. And there's also the fact that it's always been associated with Catholicism or as a Christian relic. It's never really been throughout the centuries a Muslim thing. So, what do you make of someone would counter and say, well, no, it's clearly supporting Christianity?
Yeah, it's a very logical viewpoint. So let's take a couple of the things you mentioned. Oh, let's start with the easiest one. The third one, totally, it's a Christian relic because the immediate followers at that time they would have been Christians. Those who preserved the shroud in its earlier stages would have been Christians. There's some evidence that maybe at some point it was preserved under some kind of Islamic rule, but that wouldn't have been, Muslims wouldn't have had a veneration of the shroud. Even today, it's the Ahmadiyya Muslims who believe he survived that hold the shroud in, think it represents something special. If the Orthodox Islamic viewpoint is Jesus was never on the cross, then the shroud really doesn't play in their thinking, which is why you don't find many Muslims who talk about the shroud actually. So I'm happy with it being a Christian relic. That's not an issue at all. The rigor mortis, let's talk about that. So again, I'm not a medical expert, but what I've done is read what other people have written about this topic. And there was a gentleman called Miguel Lorente, who's written a paper. I think he presented it in 2008 originally at a conference in Ohio. And it's linked on Barrie Schwortz's shroud.com website. Now, interestingly, he's a Catholic by faith, but he basically said he's written a paper that says it analyzes the lack of signs of death and the signs of a living person in the shroud. And so he goes through it from a forensic point of view, which is his area of expertise. He's a lecturer at the university in Granada, I think. So he basically goes through his analysis, which is more detailed than what I could do, and I'm not qualified to give that, but I can share that link with you, Dale. You can share it with your audience to his paper, and there you'll see how he explains that he doesn't see rigor mortis. He sees a firmness and a tension in certain parts of the body, but not consistent with rigor mortis, which would be across the whole body. And he goes into detail about that, about the lack of visibility of thumbs and what that means. And then he also talks about, the position of what he thinks the body would have been in, and also the fact that I believe he feels like there was some kind of a cushion or some kind of padding under certain parts of it. And in his paper, there's a diagram. So again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier, and what Barrie has often said to me, and when he's spoken to the Ahmadiyya community, he was like, you will get different scientists, different experts that will look at the same empirical evidence and draw very different conclusions from it. And that's kind of the world we're in right now. So now, and that's not a problem. And I encourage and welcome the debate that happens. I think that's a really good, healthy thing. Even as Muslims, we're desperately encouraged to seek out knowledge. Don't just believe on something because your forefathers have believed on it. Like, analyze, scrutinize, and seek knowledge. So I always find it enriching to read different viewpoints and people trying to figure out this mystery. But he has talked about a lack of not rigor mortis actually, but actually saying that there is tension and there's certain muscles that look like they are contracted, but it's not something seen across the whole body. And the decomposition part is interesting, because then decomposition to me suggests the body was still alive. It would be if it wrapped a live body. Let me phrase it this way: if it wrapped a live body, and we believe Jesus had survived and didn't die, then that would also have led to an image that showed no decomposition in terms of the body, because he wasn't going through a dying process and etc. The body was still very much alive. So there are different viewpoints. Like Rodney Hoare is another scholar. I believe he was even chairman of the British Shroud of Turin Society at one point. So we're talking about the 70s or 80s. Again, from a Christian, coming from a Christian background, who wrote a book around, the shroud, proving that Jesus survived the crucifixion. So there are a range of viewpoints. I remember I read about the shroud in my early 20s. I was like, right, finally, we have now got something conclusive that is going to settle this debate. I don't think it has. I think it's blown the debate even wider open, and it's opened up new aspects to the debate as well. So, it's fascinating. I love talking about it. I enjoy talking about it. I love reading about it. I've been enriched by meeting so many different people from different walks of life. I wouldn't be here talking to you now if it wasn't for the shroud. But it's really hard to kind of get conclusive evidence and draw conclusive conclusions. Like I think to put into context how long ago the Stirp's work was, because saying it was 40 years ago, etc. Sometimes we lose the significance. Like, look at the size of the cameras that they used, and that will put into perspective how out of date the technology is by modern standards. And I hope at some point, there will be more tests can be done. I know how hugely controversial it is, but I hope we can delve more into the shroud and try and understand its mysteries, and ultimately what its meaning is I don't know. I think we will find out in a few decades time what its significance. But right now it's still it's sort of elusive as it is. The image formation technique is as elusive as what its meaning really is.
For sure. Yeah, it needs more testing. I think we're all on the same page there. Stirp too, we need that. So.
Yeah.
All right. I have a couple follow-ups. These come from Christian audience members, and they wanted on this question, they kind of wanted me to ask this. So this is a common objection. This applies not just to Ahmadiyya Muslims, but it's kind of a common objection to all Islam, where they say, okay, well, look, okay, somehow Allah prevented Jesus from dying on the cross in one way or another. But we have this weird thing where, well, his disciples, after seeing him, came to this wrong conclusion where they thought Jesus died and rose from the dead. So it's kind of a common objection. Well, wouldn't this theologically make Allah kind of a deceiver, or worse, maybe Jesus is a deceiver and lying to them? Yeah, what do you make of that?
It's a really good question. So first of all, I would say that I don't see, so in the events of the crucifixion, so I know, for example, Hugh Schonfield, a famous scholar, talked about the Passover plot. And in the Passover plot, he talks about Jesus fulfilling prophecies on purpose to try and prove that he was the Messiah. It's almost like premeditated, on purpose, fulfilling things for the sake of it. There's an element of deceit almost in the way he describes it. I don't believe in that. I believe that Jesus was a truthful prophet. As far as he was concerned, if you imagine he was put through this punishment, he prayed to be saved from it in the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane. I believe his final cry of, my Lord, why hast thou forsaken me, is his belief that, hang on, you're supposed to save me from this punishment. We're told in the New Testament that he prayed to be saved for the cup to pass from him, and that an angel strengthened him and gave him strength. And I believe that angel was telling him, look, God will protect you and will save you. So his last cry is like, why is this happening? This wasn't part of the script, if you like. What happened next in terms of the body being taken down and nursed back to life, and then him continuing to, nursed and revived, and then he's continuing his mission. I don't believe there's any deceit in that. I think Jesus would have basically, if he had been revived, would have felt this is through God's grace that this has happened to me. This is a miracle, and it was a miracle. We still believe it to be, miraculous that he was saved in this way. And his mission doesn't change. His mission is to continue to preach and to preach to others. Now, he showed himself to his disciples so that they would have faith in him and that they would believe in him. Now, theology is it's hard to understand, how do we trying to separate those events from a prophet who being put through a trial and surviving and then continuing his mission versus a prophet who came to die for our sins and once resurrected told everyone, I have resurrected, this was fulfillment. It's hard to separate those two narratives because it gets into theology, right? Which then gets into the whole question of who did Jesus say he was? What evidence do we have of that? When was that viewpoint of Jesus codified? And we don't have time to get into the answers of these. So let me just tease the questions out there. What did Jesus say about himself? Who recorded that? does the influence of the viewpoint of the authors have an impact on that message? Were there different responses? When I started to study the New Testament, and scholarship around that, I was amazed at the range of responses to the message of Jesus. Who took ownership of that message after his death? Who started to codify what Christianity was? I would say that was more St. Paul, who had actually maybe never met Jesus potentially, or maybe he did at the road to Damascus, but maybe other than that, he wasn't a disciple of Jesus. So what about James, the brother of Jesus? Did he have a different viewpoint? Was their emphasis slightly different? You start to unravel this whole story about where you realize that actually, sadly, it's really complicated to know exactly what was taught and what Jesus really believed about himself and what he said about himself, because he spoke in parables. His words are mysterious in some ways. That's the essence of his style of preaching. So it's open to so many different interpretations. And that's why you get some crazy books, right? You get all sorts of books written from on the fringes as well about what the disciples of Jesus were really about and what was really going on. Because it's very scant information, right? The scant information. There's not many years of his ministry that we know about that are recorded in the Gospels, maybe 1 or 2 years only. And also, how many Gospels were there originally? How did these 4 get chosen as the authentic canon? Are there different Gospels? It opens up this whole range. So my viewpoint would be that Jesus himself didn't claim to be divine. He certainly claimed a special relationship with God. And I would say it's the limitations of our language, really, that have led us to kind of get very maybe hung up a little bit on the literal side of this. So I would interpret him and others being sons of God in a metaphorical way. Me and the Father and I being one, I would take them more metaphorically. I think he very clearly believed in a God that he prayed to, someone separate from him that he sought guidance from, that he prayed to, that he prays, that he told us to pray to, that he said is only one. Hear, O Israel, your God is one God, is a crucial thing he did say. And then I think after that, and this is typical of Islamic theology, there's been layers and layers of different interpretations and canons and councils that have led to a view now that is really hard to unpick to try and understand what Jesus really did. And there's thousands of books probably written on this by people way more qualified than me that have gone into the analysis of what he really said, what were his true sayings, what did he really believe? And there's been a range of outcomes just in the Christian world. Forget Islam for a second, just within the Christian world, there's so many different responses to the person of Jesus and what he was. So I think it's not surprising that then when an Islamic religion comes along where Jesus is part of Islam, but the core message of Islam and belief in God is separate, when it then talks about Jesus and presents a different viewpoint, it's very easy for Muslims to accept that because there's so much debate around the person of Jesus anyway. So that would kind of be the viewpoint. So it wouldn't be that God was trying to change things, or it wouldn't be that Jesus was being deceitful. It would be that, first of all, his teaching may have been misinterpreted slightly, but also I would say that the viewpoint that he was, the viewpoint around his message being universal, go out and preach to everyone else. We now know that some of those verses were verses added later on to some of these Gospels, and that's come from Christian theology and scholarship, which I praise, and I'm really glad to have seen that. In terms of how Christians have really delved into this scripture and scrutinized it. I wish all religions did that to this scripture as well. That's where those views have kind of come from, and that's what Muslims will like kind of reference. But really, their core belief comes from the Quranic revelation.
Okay, that there's one little follow-up thing, and it's not fair to. I should have sent you in advance, but
it's totally fine. It's totally fine. I'm enjoying the discussion.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, are you aware of Dr. Mike Licona, Christian No.
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, so this isn't going to be a fair question then, but just give you a general take. And
sure.
But Mike Licona, he's kind of argued. He's provided 6 historical arguments as a secular biblical scholar, and he's trying to say, look, we can prove historically. So forget about who wrote the Gospels. We can prove within that using historical criteria that Jesus historically predicted his death and resurrection. He provides 6 arguments for that. So I just he calls this his Islamic catch-22, because so if Jesus didn't die and rose, he was a false prophet. But if he did die and rise from the dead, this shows that your interpretation of the Quran or the swoon theory is wrong. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on that. Again, I know it's not fair to you because you
It's totally fine. It's fine. So I would say one example, like one thing I'll talk about is, so first of all, did Jesus talk about his dying and resurrection, right? There are talks about him talking about elements of this, but we don't know when that came into the gospel records. It's really hard to say what he specifically said. But one thing that is recorded in multiple gospels is him talking about the sign of Jonah. So something that Ahmadiyya Muslims and others will talk about as well is this sign that Jesus said, look, I'm not going to give you. He says that, an adulterous nation demands a sign. No sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. And I think if I was to summarize our viewpoint almost, it is we believe that sign and the parallel with Jonah is deeper than maybe people realize. So we believe, he said that as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man shall be in the belly of the earth for 3 days, 3 nights. So some will say the only parallel he was drawing there was the time period, but that's their interpretation, right? And so what we would say is Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, what happened with Jonah? Jonah was someone who preached to a certain people. They rejected him. He was cast out. He was, his life was in peril. He was swallowed up by a whale, and then he took refuge. He was in the whale for these days, and then he exited the whale and he was alive again. And then he continued his mission. He carried on preaching, and he was actually successful after that incident. And that's the parallel, we would draw with the sign of Jonah, is that Jesus placed in the belly of the whale 3 days, 3 nights. Jesus was in the belly of the earth. He went in alive. He was close to death. He was or let me start the story earlier. He was rejected by his people. He was rejected. He was tortured like Jonah was. Same with Jesus. He went through this really difficult trial. He was crucified, but he was saved. For 3 days, 3 nights, he was in a perilous situation, but ultimately he came out of that. Now, during that time, Jonah was in the whale. Jonah was still alive. So we would say Jesus was alive, drawing that same parallel. And then after the incident of Jonah and the whale, Jonah continued on his preaching and was ultimately successful. And that's what we would say with Jesus as well. So that's one example of that. That is how we would interpret that one strong sign about the sign of Jonah. And we would say that in terms of, did Jesus talk about, his body like being destroyed, brought back up? He did. The Gospel of John seems to have the most advanced theology, the theology that is most in line with Orthodox Christianity and what St. Paul said as well. But then the Gospel of John is likely, it's debated, of course, different viewpoints, probably came a bit later in terms of when it was codified and put together. And the authors of those Gospels, did they have a particular viewpoint or a interpretation of Jesus that influenced how they put the story together? And we know that there were additions and changes to the Gospels in time because New Testament scholarship has kind of shown that. So I'm not trying to say that dismisses all of these different arguments. I will definitely look at this catch-22 for Muslims and read it. But I would say, that was the Muslims' viewpoint comes from direct revelation and saying that this is the true message. And when I look in the Christian world and New Testament scholarship and others, I see a lot more evidence that seems to be in support of the Islamic viewpoint than I do of the other viewpoint. But it's still hotly debated, and it's really hard to unpick when you have 2 centuries of histories, different councils, multiple responses, lots of different authors, a lot of oral tradition that then switched to written tradition at some point that we're not sure when. So there's a lot going on here, and trying to unpick it is really difficult. And it's just difficult. It's very hard to claim that we have a definitive answer with all of that going on.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, thank you for giving your answer on that one.
No worries.
So one last question for you, because I know you're probably saying, it's 2 hours already. So,
Sounds good.
all right, cool. So one last question. So we've talked a lot about your belief in the shroud and how that plays into your faith and that sort of thing. One question I wanted to ask you in general that I missed was, okay, outside of the shroud, why are you an Ahmadiyya Muslim? Why do you think that it's true? Outside, you kind of hinted in one of your prophecies, right? But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say I would start there. I would say, and it comes down to, like, I think when you have children, often you have to reassess you reassess your beliefs constantly, but you have to really distill down what your belief is, because I'd want my kids to also have belief in God. I want them to question, and I want them to analyze what else is out there. But I need to really succinctly explain it to them. So I need to have a really clear, succinct way of viewing it myself. And we're in the age of books like The God Delusion and other things like this. So we need to be really clear around our beliefs. For me, what it comes down to, and this is not just Islam, it's all religions. It's like we believe in God. Why? One is, well, we look at the world around us, and the Quran actually tells you to do this. It says, look around at the world and look at how amazing creation is. Do you see any flaw in creation around you? And the Quran then challenges you to look again and again. And it says your views, your eyesight, viewing will be exhausted before you find flaws. So we live in an amazing world that had to come about through some way. So we start off with this mystery of we exist. How did we get here? Then we start to analyze, does God exist? Now, in essence, what I believe religion and the monotheistic religions and the religions, Abrahamic faiths in particular, but probably all religions, they start off with someone making a claim, a prophet, a human being saying, God exists, believe in him, and I've been sent by him, and he talks to me or he talks through me. And then you get into the situation of, well, how do you assess someone? If there is someone claiming to be a prophet or a wise person and they're making these claims, like how do you assess whether they're true or not? So you need to look at the character and the life of the person making the claim. Absolutely. You need to look at the character and their life before they made the claim as well as after and during as well. Did that change? Were they always, is there some consistency there in terms of were they trustworthy and truthful beforehand, etc.? Like, what do we know about their character? Then it's like, what did they say? Did what they say, is it consistent? Does it make sense when I look at the world around me? Does it make sense with what I know about the world around me right now? Is there a consistency in message that I can say this holds some truth in it? And then prophecies make a really key part. What is a prophet? A prophet is someone who makes predictions. So if they made predictions, did those predictions hold true? Did they come true? Is there evidence of them coming true? Can you see a line of narration, or can you see a timeline of events, of prophecies, predictions, and then some kind of fulfillment of those? And then also, I think Jesus himself explained, how to assess someone if they're truthful or not, which is like, look at the fruits, look at their fruits. So these religious people who are making these claims, etc., what are their followers like? Do you look at those followers and are they people you want to be like? These are some of in its essence, those are some of the tools we're given. And then finally, God is saying, pray to me. If you're not sure about something, or if you want guidance, like pray to me and I will guide, I will guide people. The Quran repeatedly says that if God chooses to guide someone, then no one can, lead them astray. Or if he doesn't guide someone, then there is no one who can guide them. So pray to God, pray for guidance, be a seeker, right? To quote your podcast, like be a seeker and look openly with an honest heart. And, that's the recipe for kind of finding the truth, right? And I think I'm not going to sit here and say that Ahmadiyya Islam is the only one truth religion. Everyone should follow it. Even if that is something I believe, I think all of us have to do that, go on a journey. And all of our viewpoints and our starting points are different, right? When I was looking at what Jesus has said and trying to think, is he the Son of God? Is there something here? My starting point was different. I have an initial starting point and a bias that is going to be different to other people as well. So we have to try and put that bias to one side. Very difficult. We have to try and be objective, really hard as well. And then we have to try and look through, are there prophecies? Are there signs? Are there elements that basically lead me to believe this to be, the truth? Very, very briefly, from an Ahmadiyya Muslim point of view, I look at the claims of the founder of the Ahmadiyya community. Now, obviously, first of all, I was born into this faith, but as a rebellious teenager, it's part of the way teenagers are. That we try and question everything. I remember in my late teenage years, early 20s, I was going through the basics of what the faith taught, and it would have been in keeping with my character, let's say, to kind of go, I've read this and I've worked this out, and I'm not going to believe in this. I'm going to believe in something different. But through my own analysis and examination of the sources, and from what I could see, I saw the evidence of what I just spoke about. I saw a prophecy from the time of Prophet Muhammad that was being fulfilled today in someone coming and making this claim. I read the books of the founder of the Ahmadiyya community. He wrote over 70 books. I read and read through them. I read the revelation that he had received, and I looked firstly whether it was internally consistent. Was it contradictory? When I found it internally consistent, I looked at it versus the Quran. Is it in line with that? And I looked at it in line with my understanding of the world. Does it make sense? And then I looked at the fruits, his community that exists today. What does that community look like? despite all of the persecution that the Ahmadiyya community faces, despite us being a minority where, whose beliefs go against arguably the orthodox beliefs of the whole Christian world and most of the Muslim world, yet despite that, the community is flourishing. There were things that I looked at personally. And then also, look, let's not try and be too, what's the word, academic about this, right? Belief is a matter of the heart and the soul. So you have to also go on, how do you feel when you go amongst these religious gatherings, when you meet people, when I meet the caliph of the community, the leader, or when I see him giving a speech, is that someone who I believe is a man of God? Is that someone that is preaching something that I can agree with and I want to be part of? So I think all of those are things that have led me to be very comfortable in the Ahmadiyya Muslim belief. And I think all of those are the basic building blocks that everyone should kind of look at when they're trying to understand, what is really going on out there, and in this amazing mystery that is life.
Awesome. Well said. So yeah, that covers it in terms of the list of questions. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Actually, I should say, is there anything else that you think I've missed or that you think is important to say for the audience? Or...
No, thank you so much for having me. I realize that a lot of what I've talked about will be kind of difficult to hear, will be uncomfortable, and there's I've tried to be as respectful as I can on what I've said. I'm expressing my viewpoints and now belief, and I understand that there are a lot of different responses, and so yeah, I hope the audience takes my words in the right spirit, and I'm happy to have any if there are follow-up questions, and if Dale, if there's things you want me to talk about in future, things that may come out of this, I'd love to talk to you again. I've enjoyed the conversation, and thanks to you for being you opening up and bringing me on, someone who's got very different beliefs to yourself, and giving me the time to share my viewpoint. I've really enjoyed that conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's important. I trust my audience. They're critical thinkers. They don't always agree with me either, right? So,
Sure.
yeah, so it's great to get a different perspective. I've appreciated hearing your take on the shroud evidence and stuff and seeing where we have similarities versus differences. So, yeah, you're welcome on the show anytime for any topic you want. So,
Sure, thanks a lot.
awesome. All right, cool. Well, that's it. So just so the audience knows, next week I'm going to be having another show, Theo Geeks podcast, on the complementarian versus egalitarian debate. Can women be ministers in the church? And we're going to be looking at some of Paul's passages on that front. So, yeah, with that said, thanks again to Arif, and have a great day.
You too. Thank you very much.